Now, my interest now is why is it that people do not identify with the original names? Because Oxford Street is not the only example of place names that are completely ignored by denizens of the city. It seems to be common practice that people do not actually even know the names on the street of the streets in which they live. Now, a simple explanation for this is that, well, it's due to illiteracy or poor town planning. But I'm developing a slightly different take on the relationship between street topography or name topography and people's consciousness. Now, my sense of it, which is only now being worked out, is that places like, say, London and Liverpool and Paris and Milan and Rome have a certain mythology, a certain cultural and social, indeed political mythology. So take, for example, Baker Street, which of course is a location for 221 Baker Street, is famous for housing Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Watson. Now, Baker Street, its salience is produced partly by the book Sherlock Holmes, or the literature that has been written focusing on Baker Street, and partly by the fact that it is actually a specifically located geographical location. There is a Baker Street in London, which has accrued all kinds of interests, evolved, and now, for example, Baker Street is associated more with Arab businesses. All the big Arab banks are currently on Baker Street. So the Baker Street gets a certain salience in the popular consciousness, partly because it is written about, partly because it becomes a location for businesses, but thirdly because I already mentioned the Arab businesses. Baker Street is also a street that is known outside of London itself. So this is the first dimension of the mythology that grounds the topography of a city, is the fact that first it has to be circulated symbolically in various symbolic discourses. So it's not administrators who put the consciousness of street names in the minds of people, but the way that the names generate symbolism and are circulated via literature and other media. But the second thing is that the street also has to have a resonance beyond its location itself. That is to say, Baker Street's resonance goes beyond London. You know, the Arab world knows of Baker Street because Arab banks now have proliferated on the street. But the second aspect of mythology has to do with trauma. There's a sense in which London, many of the streets in London are named via the imperial expansion. So that now the empire, as we know, there was a point in the history of the world when the United Kingdom controlled close to 2/3 of the entire global landmass. And many of the interactions were codified in street names. Now, what I'm trying to derive out of this is the idea that the memorialization of these processes of empire involve a certain production of violence on the rest of the world, so that the second degree of the mythology of the urban scape involves violence externally. And it is this violence or this trauma engendered on other places that gets codified in the street, and such that if I went to London, or if someone from the Caribbean went to London, they might have the shock of recognizing a name which invokes a memory of the colonial experience. The third aspect of the mythology of urban topographies is that the violence also has to, or the trauma, in the case of the colonial experience, it's violence externally derived. But the third dimension of trauma has to do with internal fractures within the cityscape itself. So when we're children, we used to sing a song, London's burning, see yonder, fire, 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 pour water. Now, London did burn. It did burn historically. Apart from that, there was also a bubonic plague in London. There are all kinds of internal traumas, which internal traumas themselves get codified inside or memorialized inside inside the cityscape, and which then allow the cityscape to activate certain reminiscences and memories in the minds of both its denizens and those that encounter it externally. So the three dimensions or levels of urban mythology have to do with violence, externally generated, trauma internally due to certain social upheavals and natural disasters, and third, to do with, and the third example is the symbols and discourses that help to ground the city in literature, in film, in other discourses. The ultimate conclusion to be drawn is that the memory of the city's topography is not produced exclusively in the administrative offices of urban planners. It has to be lived in a variety of ways.